The sun was a blistering weight over the Azure Heights luxury residences, turning the surface of the infinity pool into a sheet of shimmering glass that reflected the pristine Miami skyline. Elias Vance adjusted the strap of his worn, fraying gym bag, feeling the humidity cling to his skin. He looked like any other guy who had just spent 10 hours on a middle-seat flight, tired, rumpled, and entirely out of place in a neighborhood where the landscaping cost more than most people's annual salary. His faded gray hoodie was a stark contrast to the white marble entrance, and his sneakers were scuffed from years of grinding. All he wanted was 10 minutes of silence and the cool embrace of the water he paid for every single month. As he tapped his key fob against the glass gate, the familiar electronic beep echoed in the quiet afternoon. But before he could take 3 steps onto the pool deck, a shadow cut across his path. Beatrice Montgomery didn't just walk, she patrolled. She rose from her designer lounger like a shark sensing blood in the water, her movements sharp and practiced. Clad in a flowing silk caftan that screamed old money, she held a glass of chilled Chardonnay in one hand as if it were a scepter. Her eyes, shielded by oversized designer sunglasses, swept over Elias with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't see a neighbor, she saw a stain on her perfect view. She planted herself directly in front of him, blocking the path to the stairs. The smell of her expensive, floral perfume hit him like a physical blow, clashing with the salt air. She didn't say hello. Instead, she let out a sharp, jagged sigh and checked her diamond-encrusted watch with an exaggerated flick of her wrist. She looked at him, then looked at his bag, and then looked right through him. Her voice, when it finally came, was a high-pitched rasp of entitlement that had spent decades getting its way. "Excuse me, but the service entrance is around the back near the dumpsters," she snapped, her chin tilting upwards so she could look down her nose at him. "This area is strictly for residents and their invited guests. I'm sure whatever delivery you're making can wait 5 minutes while you find the proper door." Elias stopped, his shoulders dropping an inch as he took a slow, deep breath. He had dealt with people like Beatrice his entire life, the gatekeepers who thought a zip code determined a person's soul. "I'm not here to deliver anything," he replied, his voice low and remarkably calm. "I live here." Beatrice let out a dry, barking laugh that caused her 8-year-old granddaughter, Chloe, to look up from her iPad with wide, uncomfortable eyes. Chloe reached out and tugged on the hem of Beatrice's caftan, whispering a soft plea for her grandmother to just sit down, but Beatrice brushed the child's hand away. Her focus was locked on Elias. She sneered, her lip curling to reveal teeth that were a little too white and a little too straight. "You live here? In a $3 million unit? Don't be ridiculous. I know everyone who belongs in the penthouse wing, and I certainly would have noticed you. You probably found that key fob in the trash or swiped it from a real resident's car. I've seen your type before, trying to take liberties with the amenities because you think the staff isn't looking." She stepped closer, invading his personal space, the smell of wine now heavy on her breath. Elias didn't flinch. He simply stood his ground, his eyes steady behind his own cheap sunglasses. He watched as her hand reached out, not to touch him, but to snatch the handle of his gym bag. Before he could react, she yanked it from his shoulder with surprising strength, the zipper catching and tearing open. His meager belongings, a pair of worn goggles, a microfiber towel, and a dog-eared book on architectural history, spilled out onto the hot concrete. Beatrice didn't apologize. Instead, she began kicking through his items with the toe of her Italian leather sandals, as if searching for a smoking gun. "See? Not a single designer label. Just junk. You're trespassing, and I'm not going to let you contaminate this pool with your presence." She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb flying across the screen with practiced aggression. "I'm calling security right now, and then I'm calling the police. We're going to find out exactly whose bag you stole this from." Elias looked down at his ruined bag and then back at the woman who was currently screaming into her phone about a suspicious intruder. He realized she didn't recognize him at all. She didn't see the man who had signed the checks for the very renovations she was currently standing on. To her, he was just a hoodie and a gym bag. A small, cold smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You're making a big mistake, Beatrice," he said quietly. But she wasn't listening. She was too busy telling the security guard that she felt threatened, her eyes gleaming with the cruel satisfaction of someone who believed they were finally taking out the trash. As Beatrice's voice rose into a shrill crescendo of accusations, the modern luxury of the pool deck seemed to dissolve, the sounds of her screaming replaced by the rhythmic, haunting scrape of a mop against linoleum. 15 years ago, the world felt much colder for Elias Vance. Back then, he didn't wear hoodies out of choice, he wore them because the heating in his basement apartment had been cut off for 3 weeks. He could still feel the phantom weight of the heavy industrial bucket he used to lug through the hallways of Sterling and Associates, a prestigious architectural firm where the floors were polished to such a high gloss that he could see his own hollow, tired eyes reflecting back at him. He was 19 years old, working the graveyard shift as a janitor, his hands perpetually smelling of bleach and lemon ammonia. While the city slept, Elias worked under the hum of flickering fluorescent lights, but his mind was elsewhere. In his back pocket, he always carried a crumpled set of blueprints he'd fished out of the trash, discarded designs for skyscrapers and luxury lofts. During his 15-minute breaks, he wouldn't eat, he couldn't afford to. Instead, he would spread those blueprints across a cleaning cart and trace the lines with a shaking finger, teaching himself the language of steel and glass, calculating loads and wind resistance by the light of a janitor's closet. It was during one of those quiet mornings, just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, that he first encountered the ghost of his past. Beatrice Montgomery had been a junior executive then, a woman whose ambition was matched only by her cruelty. She had walked into the lobby, her high heels clicking like a metronome of impending doom. Elias had been buffing the marble near the entrance, his back to her, when she stopped abruptly. He could still remember the sharp, metallic click of her tongue against her teeth. She didn't see a young man trying to build a future, she saw an obstacle. She had marched over to him, her eyes narrowing as she looked at his old, battered car parked in the very back of the lot, the only place he was allowed to keep it. She claimed he was standing too close to her sparkling new sedan, that his presence was bringing down the professional atmosphere of the morning. Without a word of warning, she had walked straight into the CEO's office. 10 minutes later, Elias was handed a pink slip. No severance, no explanation, just a cold command to turn in his keys. He remembered the feeling of the heavy glass doors closing behind him for the last time, the humid air of the parking lot hitting his face as he realized he had exactly $14 to his name. But fate has a strange way of opening windows when doors are slammed shut. As he sat on the curb, head in his hands, an elderly man named Marcus had approached him. Marcus was a legendary architect who had retired years prior but still kept an office in the building. He had watched Elias from afar for months, noticing the way the boy studied the blueprints instead of the clock. Marcus sat down next to him on the grimy concrete and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. He told Elias that the world would always try to define him by the clothes he wore or the dirt on his hands, but that he must choose to define himself by the empire he built in his mind. Marcus didn't just give him advice, he gave him a small, personal loan and a stack of textbooks. He saw the spark that Beatrice had tried to stomp out. Now, standing on the pool deck of Azure Heights, Elias looked at the woman who was currently demanding his arrest. The irony was a bitter pill that tasted like victory. Beatrice stood there, her face contorted in the same mask of arrogance she had worn 15 years ago, but there was one glaring difference: she had no idea who he was. To her, he was still just a shadow in a hallway, a person meant to be scrubbed away. She had spent a decade and a half becoming more bitter, more entrenched in her own perceived superiority, while he had spent every waking second building a legacy from the ashes of the job she took from him. He watched her lips move, the insults flying like poisoned arrows, but he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He realized that the trauma of that long-ago firing no longer held power over him. He wasn't the scared teenager with $14 in his pocket anymore. He was the man who had quietly purchased the very management company that oversaw this building just 30 days ago. He had come here today to see if the reports of a difficult board member were true. Beatrice wasn't just proving him right, she was handing him the rope he would eventually use to pull the rug out from under her entire world. The past and the present were finally colliding, and as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Elias knew that the shadows were about to retreat, leaving Beatrice to face a light she was never prepared for. The tension on the pool deck snapped like a dry branch underfoot as Leo, the complex's head of security, jogged toward the commotion. Beatrice didn't wait for him to arrive before she launched into a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. She began pacing frantically, her silk caftan fluttering behind her like the wings of a predatory bird. Her voice climbed an octave, projecting so that every resident on their glass-railed balconies could hear her. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Elias, who stood motionless among his scattered belongings. "Leo, look at this. Look at what's happening to our home. This man has been loitering, he's aggressive, and I caught him trying to break into the pool area with a stolen fob. And look at his bag, he's clearly been scouting units to rob." Leo looked at Elias, then back at Beatrice, his face a mask of exhausted conflict. He was a veteran who had worked at Azure Heights for 3 years, and he knew the Beatrice treatment all too well. He had seen her harass delivery drivers and interrogate teenagers, but he also knew she was on the wallboard and held his paycheck in her hands. Elias caught Leo's eye, searching for a shred of common humanity, but Leo looked away, adjusting his heavy utility belt. Beatrice didn't give him a chance to speak. She stepped into the center of the pool deck and pulled out her phone, holding it up like a weapon. She hit the record button, her face instantly shifting into a mask of faux distress for her social media followers. "Hey guys, I'm live at the Azure Heights pool and we have a major security breach," she said into the lens, her voice dripping with calculated drama. "A suspicious man has infiltrated our private property. He's refusing to leave and being incredibly threatening. This is what happens when people think they can just walk into places they don't belong. We need to keep our neighborhood safe." Elias watched the red light on her phone, knowing his face was currently being broadcast to thousands of people as a criminal. The humiliation was a cold, sharp weight in his chest. He looked around at the balconies above. A few residents were filming with their own phones. Others just sipped their drinks and watched the show with detached curiosity. No one stepped down. No one shouted for her to stop. Except for Mrs. Gable. The sliding glass door of Unit 102 creaked open, and the elderly woman stepped out, her walker clicking against the stone tiles. "Beatrice, for heaven's sake, stop this at once. I've seen that young man around for weeks, he's perfectly polite." Mrs. Gable's voice was thin but sharp. Beatrice didn't even turn around. She just flicked her wrist as if shooing a fly. "Go back inside, Agnes. You're getting confused again. This is board business." Beatrice then turned her attention back to Leo, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "Leo, why is he still standing there? Do your job. He's dangerous. I saw him reach for something in his pocket. It could be a weapon." Elias hadn't moved a muscle. His hands were visible, and his expression was deadpan. But Beatrice wasn't finished. In a sudden, blurred movement, she reached for the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. With a practiced clumsiness, she fumbled with the clasp, letting the expensive jewelry fall directly into Elias's open gym bag, which lay crumpled at his feet. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling shriek that echoed off the high-rise walls. "He robbed me. He grabbed my arm and ripped it off. Leo, he has my diamonds." The accusation acted like a trigger. Leo, fearing for his job and reacting to the word weapon, lunged forward. He grabbed Elias's arm, twisting it behind his back with a practiced jerk. Elias felt the hot grit of the concrete as he was forced toward the edge of a decorative stone planter. The plastic zip ties bit into his wrists, the jagged edges stinging his skin. Beatrice stood over him, her phone still recording, a look of pure, triumphant malice on her face. She leaned down, whispering so only he could hear, her breath smelling of expensive wine and hatred. "I told you that you didn't belong here. Now, the whole world is going to see you go away in a squad car." Elias looked up at her, his face inches from the stone, and felt a strange, icy calm settle over his heart. The trap was set, but Beatrice had no idea that she was the one who had just walked into it. The sirens of the Miami police cruisers cut through the afternoon air like a serrated blade, their blue and red lights dancing off the glass facade of the Azure Heights towers. As two officers marched onto the pool deck, Beatrice's performance reached its grand finale. She clutched her throat, pointing a shaking hand at the gym bag where her diamond bracelet lay nestled among Elias's belongings. The officers didn't hesitate. They saw a woman who looked like she belonged and a man who, in their eyes, clearly did not. Elias felt the cold, heavy bite of metal handcuffs replaces the plastic zip ties. He was hauled to his feet, his hoodie pulled back, exposing him to the judgmental stares of the neighbors now crowded on their balconies. Beatrice stood by, a smug, narrow smile playing on her lips as she watched him being led away. She thought she had stripped him of everything, his dignity, his freedom, and his reputation. But as the door of the police cruiser slammed shut, the heavy silence of the backseat provided Elias with a strange, clinical clarity. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't crying. He sat perfectly still, the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal echoing in the cramped space. He looked down at the smartwatch on his wrist, which was vibrating with an urgent notification. It was an encrypted message from his legal team. The acquisition is complete. You are now the sole shareholder of Azure Management Group. A slow, chilling heat began to spread through his chest. For years, Elias had been the victim of people like Beatrice, people who used their influence to erase those they deemed lesser. But the man in the back of this squad car wasn't a victim anymore. He was a predator who had just finished building his trap. The officer in the front seat caught Elias's reflection in the rearview mirror and frowned, confused by the prisoner's lack of fear. You got anything to say for yourself? The officer asked, his voice skeptical. Most guys are begging for a phone call by now. Elias looked directly into the mirror, his eyes locking onto the officer's. I don't need a phone call, Elias said, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of absolute authority that made the officer blink in surprise. I need you to look at the deed in my bag. And then, I need you to realize that the woman who just lied to you is currently trespassing on my property. The shift in Elias's mindset was instantaneous. The quiet, polite man who had tried to de-escalate the situation was gone, replaced by the CEO who had dismantled Fortune 500 companies before breakfast. He realized that reacting with anger would only play into Beatrice's narrative. If he fought back now, he would just be another, angry man, in a viral video. No, he decided to play the long game. He would let Beatrice have her night of celebration. He would let her tell her lies to the board and post her videos to the world. He would allow her to feel the highest peak of her perceived victory, because the higher she climbed, the more devastating the fall would be. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, already visualizing the grand opening gala, scheduled for the following evening. He could see the look on her face when she realized that the man she had tried to throw in jail didn't just live in the building. He owned the ground she walked on. The false defeat was over. The counterattack had officially begun. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct hummed with a sterile, maddening buzz as Elias sat in the holding cell, his hands finally free of the metal cuffs. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, the dead hour when the world was silent, but his mind was a whirlwind of precision and cold intent. When the cell door finally groaned open, it wasn't a surly guard who stood there, but his lead counsel, Sarah, holding a leather briefcase and a look of grim determination. She didn't need to ask if he was okay. She knew Elias Vance didn't break. She simply handed him his phone, which had been returned from evidence. The screen was a chaotic mess of notifications. Beatrice's live video had exploded, racking up hundreds of thousands of views. The comments were a toxic sludge of people calling for his head, labeling him the pool prowler. Elias swiped through the vitriol with a thumb that didn't tremble. He wasn't looking at the insults, he was looking at the timestamps. Beatrice was currently at a high-end wine bar, celebrating with her clique of WA followers, posting pictures of clinking crystal glasses with captions about taking our neighborhood back. She thought the trash had been collected. She thought she had erased him. Elias looked up at Sarah, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the smartphone. Get the IT forensics team from the firm, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that commanded the room. I want every frame of the security footage from the pool deck, the elevators, and the lobby. I want the audio from the gate intercom. And find out exactly who Beatrice has targeted in the last 24 months. If she's done this to me, she's done it to others who didn't have the resources to fight back. The next 12 hours were a masterclass in silent warfare. While the rest of the city woke up to the viral scandal, Elias was a ghost. He moved from his temporary hotel suite to secret meetings with the building's tech specialists, pulling the digital receipts of Beatrice's long history of harassment. He watched footage of her blocking a delivery driver from the service elevator and heard her muffled slurs caught on the lobby's high-definition microphones. Every piece of evidence was a brick in the wall he was building around her. He coordinated with a powerhouse PR firm, not to bury the story, but to prepare the counter-viral strike. He didn't want a quiet apology, he wanted a public reckoning. Back at Azure Heights, the atmosphere was festive, unaware of the impending storm. Beatrice was in her penthouse, surrounded by makeup artists and hairstylists, preparing for the grand opening gala. She snapped her fingers at a young assistant, complaining that her champagne wasn't cold enough and that the security situation from the day before had left her feeling distressed. She felt like a hero, a guardian of the elite. She had even sent a smug email to the building's anonymous ownership group, bragging about how she had personally handled a dangerous intruder, and suggesting she be promoted to board president. In a small, dimly lit office in the basement of the complex, Leo the security guard sat staring at his shoes. He had been summoned for what he thought was his termination meeting. When the door opened, he didn't see a corporate executive, he saw the man he had pinned to the concrete the day before. But Elias wasn't wearing a hoodie now. He was in a crisp, white button-down, his presence filling the room with an undeniable weight of authority. Leo began to stammer an apology, his voice shaking with the fear of a man who knew he'd been on the wrong side of history. Elias held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "I'm not here to fire you, Leo," Elias said, leaning against the desk. "I'm here to give you a choice. You can keep taking orders from people like Beatrice and lose your soul, or you can tell the truth tonight and start a new career as my head of security for the entire region. The choice is yours, but the clock is ticking." As evening fell, Elias took delivery of a garment bag from a tailor on Savile Row. He unzipped it to reveal a midnight blue tuxedo, the fabric so fine it seemed to absorb the light. He dressed with a slow, methodical rhythm, checking his reflection one last time. He wasn't just a man going to a party, he was a silent executioner of a corrupt status quo. The trap was set, the evidence was loaded into the ballroom's media server, and the invitations had been accepted by every major player in the city. Beatrice was about to have the night of her life, and Elias Vance was going to make sure she remembered every single second of it. The grand ballroom of Azure Heights was a cathedral of excess, bathed in the amber glow of 1,000 crystal prisms hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The air was a thick, cloying mixture of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. This was Beatrice Montgomery's natural habitat. She moved through the crowd like she was royalty, her heels clicking against the polished marble with the steady, aggressive rhythm of a woman who owned every square inch of the room. She was draped in a floor-length gown of emerald silk that shimmered under the spotlights, and on her wrist, the diamond tennis bracelet she had used as a weapon the day before caught the light with every theatrical gesture of her hand. She was holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of sycophants who hung on her every word. "Did you see the video?" she asked, her voice carrying over the soft hum of the string quartet. Her laughter was sharp and jagged, like breaking glass. "I had to take matters into my own hands. Honestly, the security here has become so lax. Anyone can just wander in off the street in a hoodie and think they own the place. You have to be firm with people like that, or before you know it, the whole property value just plummets." She took a sip of her vintage wine, her eyes scanning the room for the guest of honor, the mysterious billionaire who had recently purchased the management group and the land itself. In the corner of the room, standing in the shadows cast by a towering floral arrangement, Elias Vance watched her. He was unrecognizable. The scruffy, exhausted man from the pool was gone. In his place stood a figure of absolute, quiet power. His midnight blue tuxedo was tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been molded to his frame, and his presence possessed a gravity that made people instinctively step aside as he began to move. He didn't rush. He navigated the room with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew exactly how the night was going to end. Beatrice was too busy checking her reflection in a silver platter to notice him at first. She was deep in conversation with Mr. Henderson, another board member who was nodding along to her demands for stricter gate protocols. "We need a complete overhaul," Beatrice insisted, snapping her fingers to get a passing waiter's attention without even looking at him. "I've already prepared a proposal for the new owner. I'm sure he'll agree that keeping certain elements out is our top priority. If he's as successful as they say, he'll understand that optics are everything." Elias stepped out of the shadows and began to walk toward the center of the circle. The air seemed to chill in his wake. As he drew closer, a few people stopped talking, their heads turning as they tried to place the striking, high-powered man they didn't recognize from the social registers. Mrs. Gable, perched on a velvet chair nearby, squinted through her spectacles and let out a small, knowing gasp. Leo, standing at attention near the main doors in a brand-new, sharp security uniform, caught Elias's eye and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The pieces were all on the board. Beatrice finally sensed someone approaching her peripheral vision. She didn't turn her head fully, assuming it was another staff member or a junior associate. She reached out her empty champagne glass, shaking it slightly so the ice rattled. "More bubbles, and make sure it's actually cold this time," she said, her voice dripping with that casual, effortless condescension that had been her trademark for decades. Elias didn't take the glass. He stopped just 2 feet away, his shadow falling over her emerald dress. Beatrice frowned, her brow furrowing as she finally turned to look at the man who had the audacity to ignore her command. She looked at his shoes first, handcrafted Italian leather. Then his suit. Then, finally, her eyes traveled up to his face. For a split second, her brain failed to make the connection. She saw a powerful executive. But then, she saw the eyes. The same steady, unflinching eyes that had looked at her from behind a janitor's mop 15 years ago, and from the concrete of the pool deck 24 hours ago. The glass in her hand trembled. Her smug smile faltered, turning into a twitching mask of confusion. "You?" she whispered, her voice cracking as the first seeds of a terrible realization began to take root. "What are you doing here? How did you get past the door?" "I told security to." Her voice died in her throat as Elias stepped even closer, his height looming over her. He didn't say a word yet. He simply reached out and adjusted the lapel of his tuxedo, the gold cufflinks at his wrists glinting in the light. The room began to go quiet, the silence spreading from the center of the ballroom like a ripple in a dark pond. The stage was set, the audience was watching, and Beatrice Montgomery was about to find out exactly who she had been trying to erase. The silence that swept through the grand ballroom was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Beatrice's glass of wine remained frozen midair, her fingers trembling so violently that the liquid sloshed over the rim, staining her emerald silk gown. She looked at Elias, then at the gathered elite of Miami, then back at Elias. The man who had been pinned to the pool deck by security just 24 hours ago was now standing in the center of the spotlight, his presence radiating an authority that made the air feel thin. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, like an emperor observing a particularly foul insect. Elias stepped up to the mahogany podium, the microphone letting out a low, expectant hum. He didn't check his notes because he didn't have any. He looked directly at Beatrice, who was now backed against a marble pillar, the color draining from her face until she looked like a wax figure melting under the stage lights. "Good evening, everyone," Elias began, his voice a rich, commanding baritone that filled every corner of the hall. "I'm sure many of you have seen the video circulating online today. The one where a dangerous trespasser was caught at our pool. I'm sure you've heard Mrs. Montgomery's version of how she saved this building from a common thief." He signaled to the technical booth with a slight nod. The massive 4K LED screens behind him, which had been displaying the Azure Heights logo, flickered and changed. They didn't show real estate projections. Instead, they showed high-definition security footage from the pool deck. The room gasped in unison as they watched Beatrice pull the diamond bracelet from her own wrist and deliberately drop it into Elias's open gym bag. They watched her let out that staged, piercing scream. The clarity was undeniable, it was a masterclass in malice. Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting around the room for an exit, but the crowd had formed a solid wall of judgment around her. Elias leaned into the microphone, his eyes never leaving hers. You told me yesterday that people like me don't live in the penthouse, Beatrice. You were right. People like me don't just live in the penthouse. We own the building. I am Elias Vance, the CEO of Vance Global Holdings and the new owner of Azure Heights. A collective roar of shock erupted from the guests. The mic drop was so profound that several people actually stood up from their chairs. Beatrice's knees buckled. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but only a pathetic, choked sob came out. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice a thin, desperate ghost of its former arrogance. I was just trying to protect the community. It was a misunderstanding. Elias's expression remained stone cold. It wasn't a misunderstanding when you got me fired 15 years ago for standing too close to your car, Beatrice. And it wasn't a misunderstanding when you spent the last 2 years harassing every resident who didn't fit your personal definition of luxury. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope. This is a formal notice of your immediate eviction based on the morality and harassment clauses in your lease. Furthermore, my legal team has already filed a $10 million defamation suit and a criminal complaint for filing a false police report. As if on cue, the ballroom doors swung open. 2 police officers, the same ones who had handcuffed Elias the day before, stepped into the light. Behind them stood Leo, the security guard, his chest out and his head held high. He wasn't taking orders from her anymore. Beatrice looked at the officers, then at the screens still looping her crime, then at the man she had tried to destroy. She began to wail, a loud, ugly sound of pure terror as the officers approached. She tried to back away, her heels catching on her gown, until she tripped and fell onto the very floor she claimed to own. The diamond bracelet, the one she had used to frame him, clattered against the marble, sounding like a handful of cheap glass. As the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, Elias turned away from her, addressing the room with a final, chilling calm. The gate is officially open for everyone who earns their place through character, not just a bank account. Mrs. Montgomery, your time at the pool is over. The echoes of Beatrice's frantic screaming faded into the humid Miami night as the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving the grand ballroom in a state of stunned, thoughtful silence. The immediate aftermath was swift and surgical. Within 48 hours, Beatrice Montgomery's name had been scrubbed from every committee, every board, and every social register in the city. The viral video she had created to destroy Elias had become the very evidence used to dismantle her life. With her bank accounts frozen by the pending defamation lawsuit and her reputation shattered, she was forced to vacate her penthouse in disgrace, carrying her belongings in the same kind of cheap, plastic bins she once mocked. Elias Vance stood on the balcony of his penthouse a week later, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The weight of the past 15 years finally felt like it had lifted. He didn't feel a sense of cruel joy in Beatrice's downfall, instead, he felt a profound, quiet peace. He had already signed the paperwork to convert the ground floor retail space of Azure Heights into a community center for aspiring architects from the inner city. He named it the Marcus Center, after the man who had seen his worth when he was nothing more than a janitor with a dream. He watched from above as Leo, now wearing the insignia of Regional Security Director, greeted residents with a genuine, respectful smile, ensuring that every person who crossed the threshold felt like they belonged. 5 years passed with the inevitable rhythm of karma. The Azure Heights complex had become a beacon of diversity and innovation, its property value actually increasing because of the culture of respect Elias had instilled. One Tuesday afternoon, Elias pulled his car into a modest strip mall on the outskirts of the city to grab a coffee. As he walked toward the shop, he noticed a woman in a faded, stained uniform scrubbing the glass doors of a nearby laundromat. Her back was hunched, and her hands were red and raw from the harsh cleaning chemicals. She moved with a heavy, defeated gait, never looking up from the suds. It was Beatrice. The silk caftans and diamond bracelets were gone, replaced by a polyester blend and a plastic name tag. She was working the same graveyard and early bird shifts Elias had worked 2 decades prior. When she finally looked up and saw him standing there, she didn't scream. She didn't point a finger. She simply lowered her head, her eyes filling with a hot, stinging shame as she returned to her work. She was now the person in the background, the one people walked past without a second glance. The cycle had completed itself with a poetic, crushing precision. Elias didn't stop to mock her. He didn't need to. He simply placed a generous tip in the jar by the door and walked back to his car, understanding that life has a way of balancing the scales for those who are patient enough to wait. He looked at his own reflection in the window, no longer seeing the scared teenager or the weary traveler, but a man who had used his struggle to build a bridge for others. The world will always try to tell you who you are based on the clothes you wear, the car you drive, or the color of your skin. They will try to lock gates and build walls to keep you in your place. But true power isn't found in a title or a bank account. It's found in the quiet dignity of a person who knows their own worth. Never judge a book by its cover, for the person you humiliate today might be the one who holds the keys to your tomorrow. In the end, kindness is a choice, but karma is a certainty. And as Elias drove away into the golden Miami light, he knew that the best way to win was not just to own the building, but to be the kind of man who makes sure the door stays open for everyone,